Okay, this is Block 6, the Great Depression, Section 4, the 100 days with the term starting with the bank holiday. As we've seen previously in this section, one of the biggest problems in the American economy was the complete collapse of the banking system. Thousands of banks had gone under, had gone bankrupt, had closed their doors since the crash 3.5 years earlier, or 3 years earlier. And the worsening economy and the lame duck period had lent itself to even more economic inactivity. People were literally taking money out of good banks and just putting it under their mattresses, which doesn't do any good for an economy there, certainly. So the first thing Roosevelt did, literally the afternoon of his inauguration, he took his oath of office, went back to the White House, and declared a bank holiday, closing every single bank in the United States for a period of 3 or 4 days. And what he was going to do in that 3 and 4 days was determine which banks were safe, which banks were secure, and then only open up banks that the government determined to be safe and secure. The idea being that if the government assured that the banks were secure, people would take their money out from underneath their mattresses and put it back into the American banking system. That was known as the Emergency Banking Relief Act. It was an act which kind of determined which banks were good and which banks were not, which banks were secure and which banks were not. Banks that were strong were reopened after a few days. Banks that were a little shaky were given government assistance so they wouldn't be as shaky. Roosevelt went on the radio, which was, of course, as you know, the main medium of communication in 1933. Roosevelt goes on the radio and gives one of his first, what becomes known as a fireside chat. And just listen to the term, fireside chat. By the fireside hearth and home and domestic tranquility and, mom and dad and kids standing, and here we have the pictures, mom and dad and their teenage son gathered around the radio listening to President Roosevelt in his patrician New York accent talk about hope and optimism and all those wonderful things like that, and pretty much saying, look, the banks that are open are safe. Put your money there. Get the economy going again. Take your money out from underneath your mattress. Put it back into America's banks. America's banks are safe. America's banks are secure. And this first of many fireside chats did a lot to connect the American people to the president. It connected the American people to Roosevelt. It gave them a sense of security and hope in a despairing and hopeless world very often. And the American people loved him for it. And that's how he would speak to the American people, like he was speaking as, a grandfather to his family around the fire on a Thanksgiving night or on a Christmas night. And it assured and inspired many millions of Americans. So after this first fireside chat and after the banks opened up, the immediate crisis of banking was over. It was a great success of Roosevelt's earliest days of his administration. People did start putting their money back in banks. Those banks were declared safe by the government, and they could begin engaging in economic activities such as lending once again.